I was growing up, we didn't have a religious household. Both my parents are from the former Soviet Union, and I would say that we had a kind of non religious, not militantly atheistic, but just non religious household. Although, when I was in my teenage years, at one point, my mom became religious. And as teenagers sometimes do, I rebelled. Now, the way I rebelled was I thought I would refute religion. Pretty straightforward, become a edgy teenage atheist. And so the way I do that with a bookish character is to go get a book that really makes the case. And so the book I picked up was called The Case Against God. And now it's a strange, unexpected turn of events, I guess, in my own intellectual history. And you probably have some version of this for yourselves, in which case I'd love to hear about it. And if you don't, maybe you will. But the effect that the book, The Case Against God, had on my intellectual development was that it showed me the weakness of atheistic criticisms of religion. And in particular, there's one argument that stood out for me as being conspicuously weak or missing something crucial. And that was this. It said that people who are religious, they believe the world has been created, let's say. And now, keep in mind all of the different possible ways you can be religious, but let's narrow it down to this real key monotheistic axiom that there's a creator of the world. And when asked, well, who created the creator or where did the creator come from? People say that's just the first principle. There is no before the creator. The creator doesn't come from anybody else. He's the first principle. And so the Case Against God book said the following. Atheists say, look, you are invoking an unexplainable first principle to explain the universe. That means that you're okay with an unexplainable first principle because you just used one. So we say the same thing that you say about God, we say for the universe. The universe has always existed. It doesn't need to be explained. It doesn't need to have something behind it, just like God doesn't need to have something behind him. So if you are okay with the idea of an unexplained first principle, you don't actually need to invoke God as the unexplained first principle because the universe itself can be the unexplained first thing, unexplained first principle. Does that make sense? That was the argument in the book, one of many, but the one that stood out for me, in this book called The Case Against God. And what really struck me in that moment, and by the way, in my view, intellectual development, it does have many different rhythms to it. And there's the slow, steady rhythm of a lifelong learning process. But there are also those moments that just cut through and they leave a mark and they're with you forever. So this was one of those moments for me. What stood out was that the kind of being of the universe is not the same as the kind of being of God. The parallelism breaks down. People who talk about God being the first principle, they don't mean something extended in space, something spatial, something possessing mass, something differentiated in the way that the universe is differentiated. They mean a different kind of being. Now, the book had, to my recollection, or at least at the time, no notion of how that factors into the argument, no sensitivity to the breakdown of the parallelism. So again, atheists said you invoke God as the first principle, but you can't explain God. Well, we just invoke the universe as the first principle and we can't explain the universe. And if you're okay with an unexplained first principle, then you don't need, so they drew that parallelism. But the question of the kind of being makes everything much more difficult. And I think that later, when I turned to the study of mysticism, when I turned to phenomenology, to fundamental ontology, metaphysics, and in particular, eventually, after a long journey, to Heidegger, where the reflection about clarifying what we mean by being is really at the heart of the intellectual project. Well, this encounter with the Case Against God book, this first act of teenage atheistic rebellion or whatever it happened to be, this desire to see whether the arguments can be made good or not, that's what led later to this sensitivity to the question of kinds of being. What do we mean by being? Is it the same thing, the being of my watch and the being of my pencil and paper, the being of my coffee cup, which I don't have with me today? Is that the same as the being of the human being? Is that the same as the being of what we call the world? Or are these somehow different kinds of being? So that's how the book called The Case Against God failed for me, the reader, to make the case against God, and actually opened up a door to sophisticated, thoughtful, and richly rewarding reflections on the meaning of being, with the full divine, mystical, religious, and theological dimension of that question suddenly becoming completely salient, wide open, and a beautiful garden to explore. So I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a book like that sort of, you went into it with one intention in mind and you came out of it with the exact opposite result? And anything else that you'd like to share in the comments would be great. So there you go. That's my story about the case against God. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm Michael Millerman. Like, share, subscribe, comment, and see you in the next video.